Hello, everyone. We're about to start Chapter 9 here on homicide, assault, and family violence. So first we'll start off with some definitions and then look at some demographic factors, weapons, psychological aspects, family violence, infanticide, and some aspects of partner and family abuse. So before we get too far into this, it's important to remember what we looked at in the beginning with the violent crimes that are reported in the UCR. So remember that murder is only 1% of all of the violent crimes reported. So keep that in mind, although this chapter and chapter 10 look a lot at murder, it's not as common as a lot of the other crimes, and quite the opposite. As we see here, aggravated assault is 62%, forcible rape is about 7%, and robbery is about 30%. And we'll learn more about rape in chapter 12 as well. So again, it's only about 1% of all reported violent crimes. And something that we'll look at in this chapter specifically is that although we might fear stranger homicides from movies and TV shows, it's really not the norm. Most of the time, we do know the relationship between the victim and the offender, and stranger is not that relationship. So it's not the norm, although we might fear it is not what is the most common. So usually when I do this in person, I ask, why do we study homicide? And I open it up for questions. Obviously, it's more difficult here. But take a moment and think about why we think and we are interested in learning about homicide. So why is it important that we look at it in this class, or research or study it, or we collect data on it? It is the most serious crime, I hope we can agree, and the most important to try and understand more and try and prevent, because a life is lost, or it's attempted at being lost. Arguably, as we also see in TV and movies and documentaries, it is the most interesting crime to study. Why would somebody do the worst and take someone else's life? There are practical reasons to actually trying to stop people from committing this in the future, save lives, and again, predicting it as well. So can we try and get it before it even happens? Can we figure out where it might be more likely to happen, or who's the most likely victim, and try and put things in place to stop it? Our culture is not unique in having a fascination with violence. We are exposed to it quite early on, at the very least from the news. And I'm very sure many of us have heard about being desensitized to violence. We've certainly heard about a lot of mass shootings. It's not something that is very surprising, unfortunately. So we certainly can get desensitized, which means that once we have it occur more often, when we hear about it happening again, it really doesn't make as big of an impact on us. It also makes it appear like it's something that happens all the time, when in actuality, it's quite a rare occurrence, especially in contrast to the other violent crimes, like in the UCR. Another thing that plays into this is the availability heuristic. So if you were in a psychology class, not just any of them, but there are particular classes that go into a lot of the heuristics, the professor would tell you that a heuristic is a cognitive shortcut that we use to make inferences, or basically it's a mental shortcut. And they are things that we do pretty automatically without having much thought to it. We do this because oftentimes they are correct and they save us time. So I remember from one of my undergraduate classes, a professor saying we are cognitive misers, which is kind of a funny thing to picture, but we're kind of not wanting to expend any extra energy, basically. So we want to kind of stay and keep all of our energy to ourselves. And so whenever we can use these heuristics, our brains will just do that. So one particular heuristic is the availability heuristic. And we apply this to crime in that whenever we think of crime, we remember the most frequent and horrific accounts. Why is that? That's because that's what we see on the news. We see the things that if it bleeds, it leads. We see that the most horrific accounts and shocking things make the news. And so it increases our likelihood to fear that particular crime and makes it seem like it's a lot more commonplace than it really is. Another thing before I forget is that heuristic in describing the availability heuristic is not going to be enough. So, for example, maybe it's on a quiz, maybe it's on a test. Just saying heuristic is not going to be enough because, as I stated briefly, it's more than just this one heuristic. So you need to give me the specifics, meaning the availability heuristic. So make a note of that to yourself. So getting back to the availability heuristic, it might not necessarily seem like it actually changes the way we act or behave, but we'll take an example here. Not surprisingly, after 9/11, a lot of people feared airline travel. Instead, because they feared airline travel, they decided to drive to their destination. In case you've never heard this before, driving is a lot more dangerous than flying on an airplane. Specifically an airplane like the one in this picture for commercial airline travel. So driving is a lot riskier, or is riskier than flying. Therefore, the fears that people had from this high impact or highly publicized account that was extremely rare changed the way that we thought and behaved. And coincidentally, the fears about dying in a plane crash led to more deaths from automobile accidents. So yes, this does affect us. Obviously, this didn't necessarily affect everybody, but this is just one example of how the availability heuristic can affect us. Now let's get into some definitions. Let's start out with, are homicide and murder synonymous? In other words, do they mean the same thing? So you're probably thinking no, because she's asking this question. So now think about, what is the difference between them? The big difference is that homicide just means killing another person. Not that just, but it means killing another person. And it can be justifiable or excusable. So, if you were to live in a state where the death penalty is legal, there's someone that has to cause the death of the person that is to receive the death penalty. Is that person then charged with a murder? No. That person is allowed to do that. It is excusable or justifiable because of the law in that state. And that is one example. Another is self-defense. If someone breaks into your home and could possibly kill you, you are allowed to defend yourself. Perhaps you end up killing that other person, but that would be an example of self-defense. So, being more specific here, criminal homicide is causing the death of another without legal justification or excuse. So you have killed someone else, but there is not a legal reason why you did it. Excuse me. So there are two definitions that fall within this. The first is murder, and because our definitions can change across different states, we're not going to talk about first degree, second degree, but this one would be what is synonymous with first degree. So murder is the unlawful killing of another with malice aforethought. And we'll get more into that in just a little bit. The next is non-negligent or voluntary manslaughter. Again, this is something that'll change based on jurisdictions, so they gave us both versions. And this is the unlawful killing of another, but without malice aforethought. And this could be in the heat of passion, for example. So my stereotypical example that always comes into my mind when I talk about this is, let's say you come home and you find your spouse in bed with someone else. You weren't planning on this, and in the moment you are so enraged that you find a weapon that is nearby and you kill them both. You're not planning this beforehand, and you're reacting in the heat of passion. This could potentially be a voluntary manslaughter. Okay, last here we have negligent or involuntary manslaughter. So you'll understand that the negligent and non-negligent are opposite, and voluntary and involuntary are opposite terms. So this one means killing another due to recklessness. So if you knew that what you were doing could have possibly led to someone's death. So if we take this image, for example, we can imagine that maybe somebody decided to drive home drunk from the bar, and they should have known better. They should have known that perhaps this could have led to an accident or worse. And on their way home, they hit a person on a motorcycle and caused their death. We need to contrast this with someone who perhaps hit someone with their car, but they couldn't have avoided it. So let's say you're driving home from school and somebody just runs out in front of your car. You are going the speed limit. There's no way you could have avoided them. That would not be the same situation. So it's important here to, again, consider that recklessness as part of the definition. So there is no intent to kill with this definition, but nevertheless, they did result in someone's death. But you still could have known that a death may have occurred because you're doing something that you know could, in the case of alcohol, impair your driving to where you wouldn't be able to react quickly enough. This also isn't included in the UCR, and is something that once we get through a few more things on this definition, we're not going to be looking at for the rest of this chapter. So I want you to stop now and watch the video on the doctor who was in charge of treating Michael Jackson at the time of his death and how it relates to involuntary manslaughter. Okay. Now before, recall we talked about premeditation. This is where they basically have thought about it before committing the murder or the killing. The time frame isn't necessarily important, but you have to have some kind of thought about it beforehand. Which of the definitions we've talked about include this? Murder. And the other two do not. Next, intent to kill, which has it, murder. Hopefully you just know that is both. And there's one more, non-negligent or voluntary manslaughter.